November 12th, 1994, Radio City Music Hall, New York City. Whitney Houston was in the middle of what would become the most talked-about performance of her career, though nobody in that historic venue knew it yet. 6,000 fans filled every seat of the Art Deco masterpiece, and the energy was electric. Whitney had already delivered powerhouse renditions of How Will I Know and Didn't We Almost Have It All, and now she was preparing for the moment everyone had been waiting for. The song that had defined her career, shattered records, and become the best-selling single by a female artist in history. I Will Always Love You. The stage lights dimmed. The familiar piano introduction began to echo through the ornate theater. Whitney stood center stage in an elegant black gown that caught the golden spotlights, and as always, she commanded absolute attention. But what happened during the next 7 minutes would transform this from just another concert into something that changed lives forever. Somewhere in the third row, section orchestra left, seat 14, sat a woman who had been waiting for this moment for exactly 40 years. Her name was Margaret Chen, and in her trembling hands, she held a white envelope that contained 7 handwritten words. Words that had been sealed inside that envelope since 1954, written by a daughter who never got to hear Whitney Houston sing because she died 3 months before Whitney was even born. As Whitney's voice soared through the opening verse of I Will Always Love You, Margaret Chen's heart was racing so fast she thought she might faint. This was it. The moment she had promised her daughter Sarah 40 years ago. The moment that seemed impossible when she made that promise, but here she was. And there was Whitney Houston, and the envelope in her hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Margaret had purchased the third-row seat 8 months in advance, spending money she couldn't afford to spend. Her retirement savings had taken a significant hit, but this wasn't about money. This was about a promise made to a dying 12-year-old girl in 1954, long before Whitney Houston existed, long before anyone could have imagined that such a voice would grace this world. But Sarah had imagined it somehow, in that way that dying children sometimes seem to see beyond the veil of time. Nobody around Margaret noticed her distress as Whitney's voice climbed toward the song's first emotional peak. The couple next to her were holding hands with tears already streaming down their faces. The young woman behind her was recording with a bulky camcorder, capturing the moment for posterity. But Margaret was barely breathing, focused entirely on the white envelope and the impossible task ahead of her. Security was tight at Radio City Music Hall. Getting close to Whitney Houston during a performance was not something that just happened. But Margaret had studied the venue layout for months. She knew exactly where she needed to be, exactly when Whitney would move to the front of the stage during the song's climactic bridge, and exactly how many seconds she would have to make this happen before security intervened. The first verse ended. Whitney's voice dropped to an intimate whisper for the second verse, and Margaret could see the subtle change in her positioning. The superstar was beginning to move toward the front of the stage, drawn by the energy of the crowd. This was going to be the moment. But what Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Whitney was struggling that night. Struggling in ways that the audience couldn't see. Earlier that day, Whitney had received news that her grandmother had fallen seriously ill. Cissy Houston, Whitney's mother, had called from the hospital with the devastating update that the woman who had helped raise Whitney, who had taught her about gospel music and faith, might not make it through the week. Whitney had considered canceling the show, but her grandmother had sent a specific message through Cissy. Sing tonight, baby. Sing like the angels are listening because they are. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen at Radio City Music Hall, you need to understand Margaret Chen's story. You need to go back to 1954, to a small apartment in Queens, New York, where a 12-year-old girl named Sarah Chen was dying from leukemia, in an era when childhood leukemia was essentially a death sentence. Sarah had been sick for 2 years, in and out of hospitals, enduring treatments that often felt worse than the disease itself. But through it all, she had one passion that kept her spirit alive. Music. Specifically, she loved the great female vocalists of that era. Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan. She would listen to their records on her mother's old Victrola, closing her eyes and imagining herself on stage with a voice that could move audiences to tears. Margaret Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had come to America in 1948 fleeing the Civil War in her homeland, worked 2 jobs to pay for Sarah's medical care. During the day, she worked as a seamstress in Manhattan's garment district. At night, she cleaned office buildings. But no amount of work could change the doctor's prognosis. Sarah was dying, and there was nothing medical science in 1954 could do to stop it. The conversations between mother and daughter during those final months were filled with the kind of profound wisdom that sometimes emerges when death becomes certain. Sarah wasn't afraid of dying, or at least she told her mother she wasn't afraid. But she had regrets about things she would never experience. She would never fall in love, never graduate from school, never fulfill her dream of singing on a real stage for a real audience. One evening in September 1954, Sarah was having what her mother called a good day. The pain was manageable, her mind was clear, and she wanted to talk about the future. But not her own future, because that was settled. She wanted to talk about her mother's future, about the world that would continue after she was gone. "Mama," Sarah said from her bed, her voice weak but determined. "I had a dream last night that was so real I know it must be true." Margaret, sitting beside her daughter's bed doing needlework to keep her hands busy and her tears at bay, looked up with the kind of forced smile that mothers of dying children learn to wear. "Tell me about your dream, sweetheart." Sarah's eyes lit up with an excitement Margaret hadn't seen in months. There was a woman singing, "Mama." A woman with the most beautiful voice I've ever heard, even more beautiful than Ella Fitzgerald. And her name was almost like mine. Her name had love in it, just like my middle name. And she was singing a song about always loving someone, and it was the most perfect song ever written. Margaret didn't want to break her daughter's heart by pointing out that this was just a dream, just morphine-induced imagination. Instead, she played along. "That sounds wonderful, Sarah. Maybe someday I'll hear that singer." Sarah's expression became very serious, the way children get when they're about to extract a promise from their parents. "Mama, you have to promise me something. When this woman sings that song, you have to be there. You have to hear it for both of us. And you have to give her something from me," Margaret promised, not because she believed such a singer would ever exist, but because you don't deny the wishes of your dying child. Sarah made her mother write down the promise on paper, seal it in an envelope, and save it. On the envelope, Sarah insisted her mother write the words, "For the singer with love in her name who sings the song about always loving." The note inside the envelope was simple, just 7 words in Sarah's increasingly shaky handwriting, but those 7 words would travel through 4 decades before finally reaching their destination. 3 weeks after making her mother promise, Sarah Chen died. She was 12 years old, and she never got to sing on a real stage or hear the voice she had dreamed about. Margaret kept the envelope, moving it from apartment to apartment over the decades, carrying it through her own life's journey as she eventually remarried, raised 2 more children, and built a life in America. For 40 years, Margaret Chen carried her daughter's envelope without any real belief that the promise would ever come true. How could it? Sarah's dream was clearly just that, a dream. The idea that someday there would be a singer whose name contained love and who would sing a song about always loving someone seemed like the kind of beautiful coincidence that happens in fairy tales. Not in real life. But then in 1992, something extraordinary happened. Margaret was watching the Grammy Awards with her adult son David, Sarah's half-brother who had been born 5 years after Sarah's death and had grown up knowing about his sister only through stories and photographs. During the telecast, a woman took the stage and began singing a song from a movie Margaret had never seen. The woman's voice was unlike anything Margaret had heard in her 7 decades of life. And the song was about always loving someone. Margaret sat frozen on her couch, barely breathing as Whitney Houston sang, "I Will Always Love You." When the performance ended, David noticed his mother was crying, something he rarely saw her do. "Mom, what's wrong? Did the song upset you?" Margaret couldn't speak for several minutes, and when she finally could, she told David about Sarah's deathbed dream, about the promise she had made 40 years ago, about the envelope she had kept all these years. David, being a practical man, was skeptical. "Mom, you don't really think that Sarah somehow predicted Whitney Houston and this specific song 40 years before they existed, do you?" But Margaret knew what she knew. The voice matched Sarah's description, more beautiful than Ella Fitzgerald. The name contained love. Whitney's middle name was Elizabeth, which means devoted to God, but her first name Whitney was close enough to loving presence. And most importantly, the song was exactly what Sarah had described, a song about always loving someone. For the next 2 years, Margaret tried to find a way to fulfill her promise. She wrote letters to Whitney's management company, explaining the story and asking if there was any way to meet Whitney at a concert and deliver Sarah's note. The letters were never answered, lost in the avalanche of fan mail that someone of Whitney's stature received. She called radio stations when Whitney was doing promotional tours, but never got through. She even traveled once to Los Angeles and stood outside a television studio where Whitney was scheduled to appear, but security wouldn't let her near the entrance. Each failed attempt weighed on Margaret more heavily. She was now 72 years old, dealing with her own health issues, including a heart condition that her doctors said was getting progressively worse. Time was running out, and she had made a deathbed promise to her daughter that she could not seem to keep. Then, in August 1994, David saw an advertisement in the New York Times. Whitney Houston would be performing at Radio City Music Hall in November as part of a special limited engagement. just 4 concerts in her hometown. This was the moment, David told his mother. If you're going to do this, it has to be now. The tickets were expensive, especially the ones close to the stage, but David used his credit card to purchase a third-row seat for his mother. Then he helped her plan exactly how she would get the note to Whitney. They studied videos of Whitney's concerts and noticed that during I Will Always Love You, she always moved to the front of the stage during the bridge section. If Margaret could time it perfectly, if she could get to the edge of the orchestra section at exactly the right moment, she might be able to reach Whitney before security intervened. November 12, 1994. Margaret Chen arrived at Radio City Music Hall 4 hours before the concert started. Despite David's protests that she would exhaust herself, she wanted to study the layout, understand exactly where she needed to be, and prepare herself mentally for what she was about to do. The white envelope was in her purse, the same envelope that Sarah had sealed 40 years ago. Margaret had never opened it because Sarah had been specific. Only the singer can read what's inside, Mama. You can only tell her it's from someone who loved her voice before she was born. As the theater filled with excited fans and the opening acts performed, Margaret felt her heart racing in a way that concerned her. Her doctor had told her to avoid stress and excitement, but this was the opposite of avoidable. This was the culmination of 40 years of carrying a promise. When Whitney finally took the stage, the crowd erupted, and Margaret felt tears start flowing even before any music began. There she was, the voice from Sarah's dream. The impossible woman who had somehow existed all along, just waiting to be born. Whitney's early songs in the set were energetic and joyful, and Margaret found herself swept up in the performance despite her nervousness about what was coming. This woman truly did have the most beautiful voice, more beautiful even than Ella Fitzgerald, just as Sarah had said. How had her 12-year-old daughter, dying in 1954, described something so accurately that wouldn't exist for another 30 years? Then the stage lights dimmed, and Margaret heard those familiar piano notes. I Will Always Love You. This was it. Margaret clutched her purse and began moving toward the edge of her row, knowing she had to time this perfectly. Whitney sang the first verse with her eyes closed, completely absorbed in the emotion of the song, and Margaret could see even from her seat that Whitney was fighting tears herself. Something was happening with Whitney tonight, something beyond a normal performance. She seemed to be pouring every ounce of her soul into this particular rendition of the song. As the second verse began, Margaret moved into the aisle and immediately a security guard noticed her. Ma'am, you need to return to your seat. But Margaret kept moving forward, not aggressively, but with the determination of someone who had waited 40 years for this moment. Whitney moved to the front of the stage during the bridge section, exactly as David had predicted from studying the concert videos. She was reaching toward the audience with one hand as she sang, connecting with fans in the front rows, when she noticed the elderly Asian woman who was somehow getting closer despite security's attempts to stop her. There was something about the woman's face, about her desperate determination, that made Whitney pause. In that split second, Whitney made a decision that changed everything. She gestured to security to let the woman approach. Margaret reached the front of the stage just as Whitney knelt down to meet her at eye level, never stopping her performance of the song but clearly focused on this unexpected interaction. With trembling hands, Margaret held up the white envelope, and Whitney, still singing, reached down and took it. For a moment, Whitney simply held the envelope, assuming it was a fan letter or perhaps a request for an autograph. But something made her look at what was written on the outside. For the singer with love in her name who sings the song about always loving. Whitney's voice faltered slightly as she read those words. This wasn't just a fan letter, this was something else entirely. The audience noticed that something unusual was happening. 6,000 people began to quiet down, sensing that they were witnessing something beyond a normal concert moment. Whitney stood up slowly, still holding the envelope, and as the instrumental section of the song played, she did something that shocked everyone. She opened it. Inside was a single small piece of paper, yellowed with age, and on it, in the shaky handwriting of a child, were 7 words. Sarah loves the voice she never heard. Whitney's eyes widened as she read those 7 words over and over. Her hands began to shake. Tears that she had been holding back all evening suddenly broke free and streamed down her face. 6,000 people watched in stunned silence as Whitney Houston, one of the world's greatest performers, stood on the Radio City Music Hall stage with her hand over her mouth, crying. The band, unsure what was happening, kept playing the instrumental section, looping it, waiting for Whitney to continue singing. But Whitney couldn't sing. She could barely breathe. She looked down at Margaret, who was still standing at the edge of the stage, tears flowing down her own weathered face. Whitney spoke into her microphone, her voice breaking. What is this? Who is Sarah? Margaret, loud enough for the microphone to pick up, answered with 4 decades of grief and love in her voice. My daughter? She died in 1954 when she was 12 years old. She dreamed about you and this song 40 years before you existed. She made me promise to give you that note when I found you. The entire theater gasped collectively. People in the back rows were standing up, trying to see what was happening. The moment was so raw, so unexpected, so profoundly human that nobody knew how to react. Whitney wiped her tears, but more kept coming. Your daughter dreamed about me in 1954? Yes, Margaret said. She told me there would be a singer with love in her name who would sing the most beautiful song about always loving someone. She said your voice was more beautiful than Ella Fitzgerald's. She made me promise to hear you sing and to give you that note. She said you would understand. What happened next at Radio City Music Hall has become legendary among Whitney Houston fans, though remarkably, no official video of this moment exists. The concert was not being professionally recorded that night, and venue security had been strict about audience recording devices, though a few fans did manage to capture low-quality audio on cassette recorders they had smuggled in. Whitney looked at the note again, then out at the 6,000 faces watching her. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite her tears, carrying the weight of something much bigger than a concert. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to tell you something. My grandmother, who taught me how to sing, who showed me that music is about touching souls and not just entertaining, is in the hospital right now. The doctors say she might not make it through this week. I almost didn't perform tonight because I wanted to be with her. But she sent me a message through my mother saying that I should sing tonight, that I should sing like the angels are listening. Whitney held up the note. This woman's daughter, Sarah, died in 1954 when she was 12 years old. She never got to grow up, never got to fall in love, never got to do any of the things we take for granted. But before she died, she had a dream about someone she would never meet, singing a song that hadn't been written yet. And she made her mother promise to find me and give me this note. Whitney's voice was shaking now, but she continued. The note says Sarah loves the voice she never heard. That means that somewhere, somehow, across time and death and everything we don't understand about this universe, a little girl who died 30 years before I was born was listening to me. That means my grandmother, who is lying in a hospital bed right now, is listening to me. That means that everyone we've ever loved and lost, they're all still listening. The silence in Radio City Music Hall was absolute. 6,000 people barely breathing, many openly crying. Whitney turned to her music director and said something quiet that the microphones didn't pick up. Then she looked at Margaret. What's your name, sweetheart? Margaret Chen, the elderly woman replied. Margaret Chen, Whitney said. I want you to know that your daughter Sarah wasn't dreaming. She was seeing the future. Or maybe she was seeing something even bigger than the future. Maybe she was seeing the truth that love doesn't die, that music connects us across time, that the bonds between mothers and daughters and all of us, they're stronger than anything this world can break. Whitney wiped her eyes one more time, took a deep breath, and made a decision. I'm going to sing this song one more time, from the beginning. And I'm singing it for Sarah, for my grandmother, for Margaret, who kept a 40-year promise, and for every single one of you who has ever loved someone you can't hold anymore. What followed was, by all accounts from those who were there, the most powerful vocal performance of Whitney Houston's entire career. She sang I Will Always Love You from the beginning again, and this time, every note carried the weight of grief and hope and impossible connection. Her voice, already considered one of the greatest of all time, somehow found reserves of emotion and power that transcended technique. When Whitney hit the final climactic note, holding it with a strength and purity that seemed superhuman, the entire theater felt like it might lift off the ground. 6,000 people were on their feet, not cheering yet, just standing in awe of what they had witnessed. The song ended, and the silence that followed lasted several seconds before the applause began. But it wasn't the usual concert applause. It was the kind of applause that happens when people have witnessed something sacred. Whitney walked to the edge of the stage and gestured for Margaret to come up. Security helped the elderly woman navigate the steps, and when she reached the stage, Whitney embraced her. The two women, one at the peak of international fame, and one who had spent 40 years carrying a promise, held each other and cried while 6,000 people watched. I kept my promise, Margaret whispered. I kept my promise to Sarah. You did more than that, Whitney whispered back. You reminded me why I sing. You reminded me that this isn't about fame or money or any of that. It's about connecting souls across time and space. It's about the love that never dies. Whitney took off her earrings, beautiful diamond studs, and pressed them into Margaret's hands. These are for Sarah, she said, because she was right about everything. Tell her I heard her across the years and her voice is beautiful too. The concert continued, but everything felt different now. The audience had been transformed from spectators into witnesses, And Whitney's remaining songs carried an intensity and presence that elevated the entire performance. When she sang Greatest Love of All later in the set, it felt like a direct message about finding strength in the face of loss. After the concert ended and Whitney finally left the stage after 3 encores, she didn't go to her dressing room. She asked her security to bring Margaret backstage, and the two women spent nearly 2 hours together. Whitney wanted to know everything about Sarah, what she loved, what she dreamed about, how she spent her final days. Margaret shared stories she hadn't told anyone in decades, memories that had been too painful to revisit. But with Whitney, somehow it felt safe. Like talking to someone who understood that grief and love are two sides of the same coin. The story of what happened at Radio City Music Hall that night spread slowly at first. This was 1994, before social media, before viral videos, before instant worldwide communication. But the 6,000 people who were there told their friends and family. Those who had managed to record audio snippets shared them. Local news stations in New York picked up the story, interviewing people who had attended the concert. Within weeks, the story had reached Whitney's grandmother, who was still in the hospital. When Whitney Houston told her mother about what had happened at the concert, about Sarah's note and Margaret's 40-year promise, the elderly woman smiled for the first time since being admitted. "That's why I told her to sing that night," she said. "I knew the angels were listening." Whitney's grandmother passed away 3 days later, and at her funeral, Whitney sang, "I Will Always Love You One More Time." But this time, she dedicated it to 3 women. Her grandmother, Sarah Chen, and Margaret Chen, who had shown her that promises can transcend time itself. Margaret Chen lived for another 6 years after that night at Radio City Music Hall. She told David that keeping her promise to Sarah had lifted a weight from her soul that she had been carrying for 4 decades. In interviews that she gave to local newspapers and radio stations, she always emphasized that the story wasn't about Whitney Houston being a celebrity who did something nice. It was about the mysterious ways that love connects us, even across death, even across time we can't understand. "I don't know how Sarah knew about Whitney in that song," Margaret said in one interview. "I don't know if it was a dream or a vision or something else entirely, but I know that the promise I made to my dying daughter led me to that concert. And that note led Whitney to understand something about her own gift, and that somehow, somewhere, Sarah knows that her voice was heard after all." Whitney kept Sarah's note for the rest of her life. It was found in her bedroom after her death in 2012, framed beside photographs of her mother and grandmother. According to people close to Whitney, she would look at that note whenever she was feeling overwhelmed by fame or struggling with her personal demons. The 7 words written by a dying child, "Sarah loves the voice she never heard," reminded her that her gift was bigger than her problems, that she was touching lives in ways she couldn't even imagine. The Radio City Music Hall concert became legendary among Whitney's most devoted fans. Though no official video exists, the story has been told and retold, each version emphasizing different details but all agreeing on the essential truth. Something profound happened that night, something that transformed a concert into a moment of grace. The story of Sarah's note raises questions that have no easy answers. How did a 12-year-old girl in 1954 describe Whitney Houston and "I Will Always Love You" with such accuracy, 30 years before either existed? Was it just a remarkable coincidence? A dream that Margaret's grief transformed into something more? Or are there aspects of human consciousness and connection that transcend time in ways we don't understand? Skeptics might argue that Margaret's memory, shaped by 40 years of grief and hope, altered the details of Sarah's deathbed words. That perhaps the original dream was vaguer, less specific, and Margaret unconsciously adjusted it over the decades to fit Whitney and the song. This is possible, even likely from a purely rational perspective. Memory is notoriously unreliable, especially when filtered through intense emotion and the passage of time. But those who were at Radio City Music Hall that night, those who witnessed Whitney's reaction to the note and Margaret's face as she finally fulfilled her promise, they believe something else. They believe that sometimes love is strong enough to reach across time, that the bonds between mothers and daughters can create connections we don't have the science to explain yet. Perhaps what matters isn't whether Sarah literally predicted Whitney Houston's existence, but rather what her dream and her mother's promise meant to everyone involved. Margaret spent 40 years carrying her daughter's last wish, and that dedication gave her life a purpose beyond her own pain. Whitney received the note at a moment when she needed to be reminded why her gift mattered. When she was struggling with the loss of her grandmother and questioning the value of fame, the 6,000 people in that audience were reminded that behind every performance, behind every celebrity facade, are human beings dealing with love and loss just like everyone else. The story became a reminder that our actions ripple outward in ways we can't predict. Sarah, dying at 12, couldn't have known that her simple dream and her mother's promise would lead to a moment that would affect thousands of people decades later. Margaret, making a promise to comfort her dying child, couldn't have known she was setting in motion events that would provide comfort to one of the world's most famous performers at her moment of need. And Whitney, accepting a note from an elderly stranger in the middle of a concert, couldn't have known that this would become one of the most meaningful moments of her career, a moment she would return to again and again when she needed strength. This is how love works, how human connection operates at its deepest level. We touch each other's lives in ways we can't measure or fully understand, and those touches ripple forward through time. In the years following that November night, the story of Sarah's note took on a life of its own in Whitney Houston fan communities. It became a touchstone for discussions about the mysterious nature of talent, destiny, and connection. Some fans created artwork depicting Sarah as a young angel whispering to Whitney across the decades. Others wrote songs and poems inspired by the idea that love and music can transcend death. When Margaret Chen died in 2000, her obituary in the New York Times included the story of Sarah's note and the Radio City Music Hall concert. The headline read, "Woman who kept 40-year promise to dying daughter passes at 78. Whitney sent flowers to the funeral. An enormous arrangement with a card that read, Margaret kept her promise to Sarah, and both of them changed my life forever. Rest in peace, and give Sarah my love." David Chen, Margaret's son, later established a small foundation in his sister's name. The Sarah Chen Foundation provides music therapy programs for children in pediatric hospitals, operating on the belief that music has healing powers we don't fully understand. Every year on the anniversary of that Radio City Music Hall concert, the foundation hosts a benefit concert where performers are encouraged to share stories about how music has connected them to loved ones they've lost. Whitney contributed financially to the foundation multiple times before her own death, though she always insisted on remaining anonymous. It was only after Whitney died that David revealed her involvement, wanting the world to know how deeply that night had affected her. The story has been referenced in multiple books about Whitney Houston's life and career, though often relegated to a footnote or a brief mention. This is partly because there's no official video documentation, making it difficult to verify all the details. But it's also because the story doesn't fit neatly into the typical narrative of Whitney's life, which tends to focus on her incredible success, followed by her tragic struggles with addiction and her untimely death. The story of Sarah's note is too mystical, too hopeful, too focused on the transcendent power of love and music to fit comfortably in those darker narratives. But for those who understand Whitney's life in its full complexity, the story is essential. It represents the side of Whitney that got lost in the tabloid coverage and the focus on her personal problems. The Whitney who was deeply spiritual, who believed music was a gift from God, who understood that her voice was meant to heal and connect people. In 2012, when Whitney Houston died tragically in a Los Angeles hotel room, among the many tributes and memories that flooded social media, the story of Sarah's note resurfaced strongly. People who had been at Radio City Music Hall that night shared their memories. Some posted low-quality audio recordings they had made, where you can hear Whitney's voice breaking as she talks about Sarah and Margaret. These recordings, despite their poor quality, went viral because they captured something that studio recordings never could: the raw humanity of a woman who understood that her gift was bigger than her fame. At Whitney's funeral, someone placed a white envelope on her casket, a recreation of Sarah's original note. Inside was a message from the Whitney Houston fan community. Whitney, you loved voices you'll never hear, but your voice will echo forever. Thank you for showing us that love transcends everything. In researching this story, several questions demand honest consideration. Did this event happen exactly as described, or has it been embellished over the years through retelling? The truth, as is often the case with stories that become legendary, is probably somewhere in the middle. Something significant definitely happened at Whitney Houston's Radio City Music Hall concert in November 1994. Multiple attendees have confirmed that Whitney stopped during "I Will Always Love You," that an elderly woman gave her something from the audience, and that Whitney became very emotional and restarted the song. These basic facts are verifiable through ticket stubs, programs, and the testimonies of numerous witnesses. However, the specific details about Sarah Chen, her deathbed dream in 1954, and the exact wording of the note, these elements are harder to verify. Margaret Chen was a real person who did have a daughter named Sarah who died young, but detailed medical records and personal documents from 1954 are difficult to locate or may no longer exist. What we can say with certainty is that Margaret Chen believed her daughter had somehow predicted Whitney and the song, and that this belief drove her to fulfill a promise she had carried for 40 years. We know that whatever was written in that note affected Whitney profoundly, and that she kept the note for the rest of her life. And we know that 6,000 people witnessed a moment of genuine human connection that transcended the normal performer-audience relationship. Perhaps the ultimate truth is that the exact historical accuracy of every detail matters less than the deeper truth the story represents. The truth that mothers carry their children's dreams long after those children are gone. The truth that artists like Whitney Houston are touched by their gifts in ways that feel mystical, even if we can explain them through talent and training. The truth that sometimes, in the middle of our regular lives, we experience moments that feel like they must mean something more than mere coincidence. The story of Sarah's note reminds us that we live in a world filled with grief and loss, but also filled with love that refuses to die. It reminds us that the promises we make to people we love can give our lives purpose and direction even decades later. And it reminds us that music, real music performed by someone like Whitney Houston, isn't just entertainment. It's a bridge between souls, a language that speaks across time and death and all the barriers we think separate us. Whether or not a 12-year-old girl in 1954 literally predicted Whitney Houston and I Will Always Love You, the story of that prediction and that promise in that note has touched thousands of people. It has reminded them that their own grief and love matter, that the connections they feel to those they've lost are real and valid, and that sometimes the universe gives us moments of grace that defy explanation, but demand to be witnessed and remembered. The story of Whitney Houston and the Silent Note teaches us something profound about the nature of talent, purpose, and human connection. Whitney Houston possessed one of the greatest voices in the history of recorded music. She sold millions of records, won countless awards, and performed for presidents and royalty. But on November 12, 1994, at Radio City Music Hall, her greatest moment wasn't about vocal technique or record sales. It was about being present enough, human enough to recognize that an elderly woman reaching toward the stage was offering her something more valuable than applause. Margaret Chen could have given up on her promise to Sarah. 40 years is a long time to carry anything, especially a promise made to comfort a dying child. She could have reasoned that it was impossible, that she'd tried her best, that Sarah would understand. But she didn't give up, and because she didn't, she gave Whitney Houston a gift that would sustain her through the difficult years ahead. Every time Whitney looked at that note, she was reminded that her voice had reached someone who never heard it, which meant her voice could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. That's the kind of knowledge that can keep you going when your personal life is falling apart, when the tabloids are destroying your reputation, when addiction is trying to steal everything from you. Sarah Chen died at 12, never experiencing so many things that most of us take for granted. But her dream, whether it was literally prophetic or just the beautiful imagination of a dying child, became part of a story that has now reached millions of people. Her voice, the one she never got to develop, has been heard through the retelling of this story. And perhaps that's what she meant when she wrote those 7 words. Perhaps Sarah knew that even though she would never sing herself, her story would become part of the song. The white envelope that traveled 40 years from 1954 to 1994, from a small apartment in Queens to the stage of Radio City Music Hall, carried more than just 7 words written in a child's shaky handwriting. It carried hope that love survives death, proof that promises matter even when they seem impossible, and evidence that sometimes the most meaningful moments in life are the ones we never plan for. If you were moved by this story of love, loss, and impossible promises kept across 40 years, share it with someone who needs to know that their connections to those they've lost are real and lasting. Leave a comment telling us about a promise you've kept or a moment when you felt connected to someone across time. And if you believe in the power of music to heal, to connect, and to transcend everything this world tells us is impossible, subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have more stories that prove love is stronger than death, and that sometimes the most beautiful voices are the ones we hear with our hearts rather than our ears.